The first time I saw her was across the main atrium of Dorelia 7. Tall, imposing, with skin the color of polished cedar and eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent their life preparing for conflict, but hoping to avoid it. Captain Saurine of the Avenari Security Forces wasn't just assigned to our diplomatic station. She commanded it. I, on the other hand, was merely Toma Reyes, human linguist, dispatched to study nonverbal communication patterns among species after the long Cold War had finally given way to tentative peace. The Avenari were particularly fascinating, a species whose neural systems processed emotional frequency through visual cues and microexpressions. They didn't just read body language, they lived it. "You're staring again," whispered Eliza Kuros, my diplomatic colleague, nudging me as we sat through another interspecies committee meeting. "Third time today." I quickly averted my eyes from Captain Saurine, who sat opposite us at the curved table that represented unity among the 12 participating species. "I'm observing," I muttered. "It's my job." "Sure," Eliza smirked. "Observe less obviously, perhaps?" The Avenari consider prolonged eye contact without vocal exchange to be either a challenge or... She trailed off, raising an eyebrow. "Or what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "A mating signal," she said entirely too loudly. Several delegates turned, including Saurine herself, who tilted her head in that specific way the Avenari did when processing conflicting data. I felt my face grow hot, a human response that, unfortunately, the Avenari were quite adept at interpreting. I buried myself in my holographic notes, pretending to be absorbed in the ambassador's speech about quantum trade routes. But in truth, I was mentally cataloging every detail about Captain Saurine that had captivated me since my arrival 3 months ago. The scar that traced from beneath her right ear down her neck, suggesting survival where others might have failed. The way she kept her hands always partially open, never clenched, never fully relaxed. The subtle shift in her posture whenever humans spoke, as though bracing for unpredictability. I had rationalized my fascination as professional interest. After all, understanding interspecies communication patterns was why Earth had sent me here in the first place. But late at night, alone in my quarters, I admitted the truth to myself. I was drawn to her in ways that transcended academic curiosity. It was ridiculous, of course. Interspecies relationships weren't unheard of, especially with the advancement of biochemical compatibility treatments. But between a human and an Avenari, our cultures were barely on speaking terms after decades of misunderstandings and proxy conflicts. And yet, I couldn't stop watching her. As the committee meeting concluded, Saurine rose with characteristic economy of movement. No gesture wasted, no energy spent unnecessarily. But then she did something unexpected. She looked directly at me, her expression neutral, but her gaze unmistakably deliberate, and held it for precisely 3 seconds longer than Avenari protocol would consider casual. My heart hammered in my chest. Had I imagined it? Was I projecting human meaning onto alien behavior? The very analytical fallacy I warn my students about back on Earth? Toma Reyes, the station's biological AI, announced through my personal comm unit. "Your presence is requested at tonight's cultural exchange reception. Attendance is mandatory for all diplomatic and research personnel." I groaned inwardly. The one event I'd been hoping to avoid. 4 hours of careful conversation and even more careful consumption of intoxicants, all while navigating the complex social hierarchies of a dozen different species. "Notification acknowledged," I replied. Eliza appeared beside me as we exited the chamber. "Perfect opportunity to observe your Avenari captain some more," she teased. "She's not my anything," I said, more sharply than intended. "Clearly," Eliza replied, unfazed. "Which is why you've been documenting her micro-expressions in your personal journal rather than your research logs." I stopped walking. "How did you?" "I didn't," she grinned. "But you just confirmed it. Look, Toma, I get it. We're stuck on the station for another year at minimum. People get interested. But maybe pick someone whose culture doesn't consider an unannounced glance to be equivalent to a slap or a proposition." I'm aware of the cultural implications, I said stiffly. Are you, though? Because the committee's noticed. The ambassador noticed. And more importantly, she's noticed. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? Eliza sighed, her expression softening. She asked Dr. Liminal about human visual fixation patterns yesterday. Specifically, whether persistent observation without engagement was considered normal behavior or if it indicated hostile intent. Dr. Liminal was our xenobiologist, an expert in comparative physiology who had been instrumental in establishing the medical protocols that allowed the 12 species to safely coexist in the same atmospheric conditions. What did he tell her? I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. That humans sometimes stare when they're processing new information, that it's rarely hostile, and that she should ask you directly if she's concerned, Eliza said, watching my face carefully. Which means you should prepare an answer that doesn't involve admitting you've developed feelings for a senior military officer from a species that considers emotional transparency a tactical vulnerability. I haven't developed, I began, but Eliza just patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving me alone with my transparent denial. The cultural exchange reception was held in the station's grand observatory, a vast dome of transparent aluminum that offered unobstructed views of the nearby nebula. Its gases shifted in hues of violet and indigo, illuminating the gathered diplomats in ethereal light. I dressed in the formal Earth diplomatic uniform, silver gray with blue accents, and tried to look inconspicuous among the assembled representatives. The Avenari delegation was easy to spot. They stood together near the eastern curve of the room, their tall frames and characteristic burgundy uniforms setting them apart. Captain Saurine wasn't with them. I accepted a glass of synthesized champagne from a hovering service drone and took a careful sip. The station's AI had been programmed to replicate Earth delicacies with reasonable accuracy, though this particular beverage tasted more like memory than reality. The carbon compounds in your beverage are misaligned, came a low, melodic voice from behind me. They attempted to compensate with additional effervescence. I turned slowly, knowing exactly who I would see. Captain Saurine stood there, not in her usual security uniform, but in what I recognized as formal Avenari attire, a high-collared tunic of deep burgundy with geometric silver embroidery at the shoulders. The scar on her neck was more visible without her standard collar, tracing a pale line against her cedar-colored skin. The taste is close enough to remind me of home, I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. She tilted her head, that analytical gesture again. Memory association is a powerful motivator for humans, she observed. You find comfort in approximations. Sometimes, yes, I admitted, when the real thing is out of reach. Interesting, she said, and I couldn't tell if she found the concept pleasing or perplexing. Avenari facial expressions operated on subtler cues than human ones. Micromovements of facial muscles that telegraphed meaning to other Avenari, but were often illegible to other species. We stood in silence for a moment, watching the nebula pulse beyond the dome. I searched desperately for something appropriate to say, something that would sound professional and diplomatic rather than revealing the complicated emotions swirling beneath my composed exterior. Your observation patterns are unusual, she said abruptly. I nearly choked on my synthetic champagne. I am sorry. During committee sessions, your visual focus rests on me for durations that exceed standard human attention patterns by approximately 43%, she continued, her tone matter of fact. Initially, I attributed this to professional interest in Avenari communication styles, but the pattern persists even when I am not speaking. He crept up my neck. This was exactly the conversation I'd been dreading. Yes, well, part of my research involves observing nonverbal cues and micro-expressions among the diplomatic delegations I managed. Among all delegates, or specifically Avenari delegates, she pressed. All delegates, I lied. But the Avenari are of particular interest, given your species' heightened sensitivity to nonverbal communication patterns. Her dark eyes studied me, and I had the distinct feeling she was cataloging my own micro-expressions, reading the truth I was trying to conceal. Why do you keep staring at me, human? The question, delivered in her resonant voice, carried across the nearby conversation circles. Several diplomats paused, their attention drawn by the directness of her query. In the sudden silence, the question hung in the air like a challenge. I froze, aware that my response would be analyzed not just by Saurine, but by representatives of a dozen worlds. I could feel Eliza's sympathetic wince from across the room, could sense the ambassador's sudden attention, could practically hear Dr. Liminal's professional curiosity peaking. I began, but the words died in my throat. The truth wasn't an option. Not here, not now, perhaps not ever. For research purposes, I finally said, the words tasting bitter. The unique, physiological responses of Avenari to environmental stimuli provide valuable data for my linguistic studies. It wasn't entirely false, but it wasn't the truth either. Something flickered in Saurine's expression, a micro-movement I couldn't interpret, before her features settled back into their customary reserve. I see, she said. In Avenari culture, such persistent observation without dialogue would indicate either threat assessment or... She paused, and I knew a word would come next, mating interest. A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the nearby diplomats. Someone, I suspected the Trilaxian ambassador, made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Cultural misunderstandings are common in interspecies interactions, I said stiffly, falling back on diplomatic platitudes. I apologize if my research methods have caused any discomfort. Saurine studied me for another long moment, then gave a slight nod. No discomfort, she said. Merely curiosity. She turned and walked away, rejoining the Avenari delegation, who immediately bent their heads toward her in what I knew was their version of whispered consultation. I stood rooted to the spot, my synthetic champagne forgotten in my hand, aware that I had just been given an opportunity to speak honestly and had chosen the safety of professional distance instead. Well, said Eliza, materializing beside me, that could have gone worse. How exactly? I muttered. She could have formally reported you for cultural insensitivity instead of giving you a chance to explain yourself in a social setting, Eliza pointed out. The Avenari aren't known for their subtlety. The fact that she approached you directly suggests she's making allowances for your human inability to communicate properly. Thank you for that assessment, I said dryly. Eliza sighed. Look, the Biosphere Exploration Team needs a linguistic specialist for tomorrow's expedition to the adaptive floral zones. Saurine is leading the Avenari security detail. I could suggest you for the position, give you a chance to smooth things over in a professional context. I groaned. After that exchange, she'll think I'm stalking her. Or, Eliza countered, she'll respect that you're continuing your duties despite personal discomfort, which the Avenari would consider honorable. Besides, it beats hiding in your quarters rewriting your research notes to exclude all mentions of her. I wasn't planning to. Yes, you were, Eliza said firmly. I'm putting your name forward for the expedition. Pack for variable atmospheric conditions. Before I could protest further, she was gone, leaving me alone with my embarrassment and a deepening sense that I had just complicated my year-long assignment in ways I couldn't yet fathom. The next morning, I reported to the expedition bay with a regulation field pack and a knot of anxiety in my stomach. The adaptive floral zones on Dorelia's surface were one of the primary reasons the diplomatic station had been established in this system. Unique botanical ecosystems that responded to emotional frequencies emitted by sentient beings. The plants didn't just react to chemical signals, as Earth's plants did to pheromones, but to the electromagnetic patterns generated by conscious thought and feeling. The scientific community was understandably fascinated, and regular research expeditions were part of the diplomatic agreement that allowed the station to remain in orbit. I was one of the last to arrive. The expedition team consisted of 2 xenobotanists, a biometric specialist, 3 security personnel, and Captain Saurine, who stood by the shuttle entrance reviewing safety protocols on a holographic display. She acknowledged my arrival with a nod, but said nothing. I couldn't tell if this was her usual professional demeanor, or if our exchange the previous night had created a new barrier between us. Team's complete, announced Commander Voss, the expedition leader. Our focus today is the transition zone between the resonant forest and the empathic moss plains. Standard safety protocols apply. No separation from a group, no direct contact with botanical specimens without clearance, and all emotional suppression implants should be deactivated. This last instruction caused a murmur among the team. Emotional suppression implants were standard for many diplomatic personnel, allowing them to moderate their bio-emotional emissions during sensitive negotiations. But in the adaptive zones, natural emotional responses were necessary to observe the full range of botanical reactions. I didn't use a suppression implant myself. My role required me to remain sensitive to emotional cues from other species, but I knew several team members did, including the Meridian xenobotanist, whose species was known for their intense emotional fields. We boarded the shuttle in orderly silence. I found a seat near the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but Saurine unexpectedly took the place beside me. "You have visited the adaptive zones before?" she asked as the shuttle hummed to life. I shook my head. "First time. I've studied the research papers, of course, but direct experience is not comparable to data review," she finished. "The zones affect different species in different ways. Humans, with your heightened limbic responses, often trigger more dramatic reactions from the flora." "And Avenari?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my discomfort. A hint of something, pride, perhaps, flickered across her features. "We maintain stronger emotional discipline than most species. The flora responds to us more subtly, more selectively." The implication was clear. Avenari considered their emotional control superior to human expressiveness. Under different circumstances, I might have debated this cultural assumption, but today I merely nodded. "Commander Voss mentioned a transition zone," I said, changing the subject. "Between forest and moss plains?" "Yes," Saurine replied. "It is an area of particular interest because the flora there appears to be evolving new response patterns, becoming more sensitized to complex emotional states rather than primary feelings." The shuttle began its descent through Durelia's upper atmosphere. Through the viewport, I could see the approach of a storm system near our landing zone. Not unusual for this region, according to the briefing materials, but potentially complicating our expedition. "The storm," I began, "is being monitored," Saurine assured me. "It carries an electromagnetic charge that may actually enhance the responsiveness of the flora. Unless it intensifies significantly, the expedition will proceed." The shuttle touched down on a designated landing pad at the edge of what appeared to be an ordinary forest, until I looked more closely. The trees, if they could be called that, had a translucent quality to their bark, and their leaves shifted slightly in hue even though no wind disturbed them. We disembarked in formation, Commander Voss leading with Saurine and her security team flanking the scientists. I stayed toward the middle of the group, recording device activated to capture any vocalization patterns that might emerge from our interactions with the environment. The air felt different here, thicker somehow, as though charged with potential energy. As we moved deeper into the forest, the sensation intensified, and I noticed the flora responding to our presence. Leaves turned subtly to track our movement, not like Earth's heliotropic plants that followed the sun, but with a more deliberate, almost conscious quality. "Remember," Commander Voss instructed, "maintain awareness of your emotional state. Strong emotions will trigger stronger responses from the surrounding flora. We're here to observe, not to influence." Easier said than done. The environment itself seemed designed to evoke emotional responses. The shifting colors triggered associations, memories, feelings that bubbled up unbidden. I found myself thinking of Earth's forests, of camping trips with my father before he passed, of the particular quality of sunlight through redwood canopies. And then I thought of Saurine, walking just ahead of me, her posture alert but not tense, her movements harmonized with the environment in a way that suggested deep awareness. When I'd first seen her in the diplomatic atrium, I'd been struck by her presence. Here, surrounded by responsive life forms, that presence seemed amplified, as though she existed in perfect resonance with the world around her. I hadn't realized I'd stopped walking until one of the security officers cleared his throat behind me. I started, embarrassed to be caught in yet another moment of fixation, and hurried to catch up with the group. But something had changed during my momentary abstraction. The path ahead had grown dimmer, and the storm clouds that had been distant upon our arrival now crowded the sky above us. Lightning flickered between them, but silently, as though the sound had been absorbed by the atmosphere itself. "Commander," called the biometric specialist, "the storm's interfering with our navigation systems." Voss frowned at her instruments. Electromagnetic disruption wasn't supposed to reach these levels. "We need to establish a direct line to the shuttle. Communications are affected as well," reported one of Saurine's officers. "The signal isn't penetrating the canopy." I felt a flutter of unease. Being stranded in the adaptive zone wouldn't be immediately dangerous. The atmosphere was compatible with most of our respiratory systems, but the unpredictable nature of the environment made it an uncomfortable prospect. "Standard protocol," Saurine announced calmly. "We maintain position and establish a defensive perimeter until communications can be restored." But even as she spoke, I noticed the forest around us changing. The translucent quality of the bark was intensifying, becoming almost luminous. The leaves, which had been shifting between green and blue, were now pulsing with a deeper indigo that matched the storm clouds above. "The flora is responding to the electromagnetic disturbance," one of the xenobotanists observed, his voice tense with excitement rather than fear. "These patterns haven't been documented before." "Or to our emotional responses to the situation," countered the other botanist. "Anxiety levels are elevated among the team." I looked at the trees nearest to me and realized with a start that they were indeed glowing more brightly in proximity to team members who appeared visibly distressed. Near Saurine and her composed security team, the glow was present but subdued. The forest was reading us, responding to us, perhaps even communicating in some way we hadn't yet learned to interpret. "We should split into smaller groups," Commander Voss decided. "Cover more ground to find a position where communications can be re-established." "With respect, Commander," Saurine countered, "separation increases risk in an environment with unpredictable properties." "Calculated risk," Voss insisted. "3 teams, each with security and scientific personnel. Team leaders will be myself, Captain Saurine, and Chief Botanist Ilari." I was assigned to Saurine's team, along with one of her security officers and the Meridian xenobotanist. Whether this was chance or Voss's deliberate composition, I couldn't tell, but I found myself simultaneously relieved and anxious at the prospect of remaining in Saurine's proximity. The teams separated, each heading in a different direction to find higher ground or clearer atmospheric conditions. Our path led toward a ridge that seemed to mark the transition between forest and the moss plains visible in the distance. As we walked, the storm intensified overhead, and the forest's responses grew more pronounced. The trees now seemed to pulse with light, creating patterns that followed our movements. "Fascinating," murmured the Meridian botanist. "The ecosystem appears to be creating a network response to our presence." "Is that dangerous?" I asked. "Unknown," the botanist replied. "But the patterns suggest communication rather than threat response." Saurine, walking point for a small group, suddenly stopped. "Look," she said, pointing ahead. Beyond the ridge lay not the moss plains we had expected, but a vast field of luminescent organisms, neither plant nor animal by conventional definitions, that undulated in waves of light. Each wave seemed to originate from a central point and spread outward, creating concentric circles that overlapped and interfered with each other in complex patterns. "That's not on our charts," the security officer noted, hand moving instinctively to his sidearm. "No," agreed Saurine. "The storm must have accelerated growth cycles. These organisms weren't present during last month's survey." Something about the light patterns mesmerized me. They weren't random, I was certain. They contained meaning, structure, intention. I stepped forward, trying to discern the pattern, when Saurine's hand shot out, gripping my arm. "Don't approach without analysis," she warned. "We don't know how direct proximity might affect human neurological systems." Her touch, firm through the fabric of my field suit, sent an entirely different kind of pulse through me. I nodded, stepping back, hyper-aware of the brief contact. The Meridian botanist had activated his scanning equipment. "Remarkable," he breathed. "The organisms are generating electromagnetic fields that mirror our own neural patterns. They're synchronizing with us." As if in response to his words, a new pattern of light emerged from the field, more rapid, more intense, pulsing with urgency. "Something's changed," Saurine said, her voice betraying the first hint of concern I'd heard from her. "We need to—" Her words were cut short by a massive flash of lightning directly overhead. The ground beneath us shuddered, and suddenly, impossibly, the ridge where we stood began to shift. Not an earthquake, something more deliberate. The land itself was moving, folding, separating. "Back to the forest," Saurine shouted, but it was too late. The ridge split, earth and stone reconfiguring like a living thing. I lost my footing, tumbling toward the luminescent field below. I heard Saurine call out, felt her grasp for me, but our fingers merely brushed as the ground gave way beneath me. I fell, expecting impact, but instead found myself enveloped in something like liquid light. Neither hot nor cold, neither solid nor fluid, but a medium that cushioned my fall while surrounding me completely. Panic seized me for a moment before I realized I could still breathe. The luminescent organisms weren't consuming me. They were supporting me, holding me in a suspended state as they pulsed with increasing brightness. Through the glowing haze, I saw Saurine leap from the disintegrating ridge, her body moving with practiced precision as she controlled her descent toward me. She landed nearby, immediately assuming a defensive posture, her expression alert but not fearful. "Are you injured?" she called to me. "No," I answered, surprised to find it true. "The organisms are holding us." The security officer and botanist were nowhere in sight, presumably still on what remained of the ridge above us or separated in another direction. Slowly, the luminescent field began to move us, not roughly, but with clear intention, carrying us toward what appeared to be an opening in the ground nearby. A cave entrance, ringed with the same glowing organisms that now transported us. "They're taking us somewhere," I said, unable to keep the wonder from my voice despite our precarious situation. "Indeed," Saurine replied, her tone suggesting she found the situation less wondrous than concerning. "Can you move independently within the field?" I tried to swim through the light, but found myself gently but firmly held in place. "No, you." She shook her head. "We are at the mercy of these organisms. But they do not seem hostile. They're electromagnetic," I reason aloud, responding to our neural patterns. "Maybe they're trying to communicate." Before Saurine could respond, we were drawn into the cave entrance. The luminescent organisms deposited us gently on a stone floor, then reseated, though they continued to line the walls of the cave, providing ambient light. The cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, a vast chamber with crystalline formations extending from floor to ceiling. The crystals refracted the light from the organisms, creating shifting patterns across the stone walls. "Remarkable," I whispered, turning slowly to take in our surroundings. "It's like the inside of a geode, but alive." Saurine was examining the cave entrance, which I now saw had sealed behind us, the luminescent organisms forming a solid barrier. "It appears we have been contained," she observed. "Or protected," I suggested. The storm was intensifying. "Maybe this is a shelter of some kind." She gave me a skeptical look. "A shelter that forcibly relocates its occupants." "Well, when you put it that way," I admitted. We began to explore the chamber, looking for other exits or any clue to the purpose of our relocation. The crystals seemed to respond to our proximity, glowing more intensely when we approached, as though acknowledging our presence. "These formations," Saurine noted, "they resemble Avenari meditation crystals, substances that amplify and reflect emotional frequencies." I approached one of the larger crystals, fascinated. "So they might be working with the luminescent organisms, creating some kind of emotional echo chamber." Saurine nodded slowly. A reasonable hypothesis. But to what end? As if in answer, the crystals nearest to us began to pulse with a soft, amber light, different from the blue-white glow of the organisms at the entrance. The color spread throughout the chamber, crystals illuminating one after another until the entire space was bathed in warm golden light. I felt a strange calm settle over me, a sense of safety despite our uncertain circumstances. Do you feel that? I asked Saurine. Her expression was difficult to read in the amber light. A calming influence, she acknowledged. But whether it is an effect of the environment or merely psychological response to the color shift is unclear. Either way, I said, I don't think we're in immediate danger. If the organisms or crystals meant us harm, they've had ample opportunity. Saurine moved to the center of the chamber, where a particularly large crystal formation rose from the floor. We should attempt to signal the rest of the expedition, she said. Your communication device? I checked my field suit's integrated comm unit, unsurprised to find no signal. Dead. Yours. Similarly non-functional. She circled the central crystal, studying it. These formations may be blocking transmission, or the storm above might still be interfering. I joined her at the central formation, noticing that the crystal seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, which was quickening with Saurine's proximity. The amber light intensified slightly. Interesting, Saurine murmured. The crystal responds to your approach more strongly than to mine. Human emotions are more accessible, I said, repeating what she had told me earlier. Less disciplined. She tilted her head, considering. Perhaps, or perhaps some emotions penetrate discipline. It was the closest thing to a personal revelation I'd heard from her, and it caught me off guard. What do you mean? Instead of answering, she placed her hand on the crystal. The amber light dimmed slightly, shifting toward a cooler, more reserved gold. Avenari learned from childhood to modulate our emotional frequencies. It is considered both polite and strategically advantageous. I hesitated, then placed my hand on the crystal beside hers. The light immediately warmed, intensifying. Humans tried that approach too. Emotional suppression, stiff upper lip, all that. Didn't work out so well for us in the long run. Yet you continue to conceal certain emotions, she observed, her dark eyes finding mine. Even now, my heart rate spiked, and with it, the crystal's glow. I withdrew my hand quickly, but the damage was done. The entire chamber pulsed with heightened amber light, reflecting my embarrassment, my fear, my longing. I don't know what you mean, I lied, moving away from the crystal and her penetrating gaze. Saurine remained by the formation, her expression thoughtful. The adaptive zones are known for catalyzing honesty, Tomo Reyes. Perhaps that is why we were brought here. By sentient plants, I asked, attempting humor to deflect from my discomfort. By an ecosystem that processes emotional energy and redirects it toward equilibrium, she corrected. Think of it as emotional weather control. I paused, considering the implications. You think the storm, the organisms, the crystals, they all work together as some kind of emotional processing system for the planet. Saurine nodded. It would explain much of what we've observed. The timing of the storm, the response of the organisms to our presence, this chamber with its amplifying properties. But why specifically? I asked. Why not the entire expedition? Her gaze was steady, unflinching. Perhaps because we represent the most significant emotional disequilibrium. The chamber's amber light suddenly intensified, then shifted, bleeding toward a warmer, reddish hue. The change was subtle at first, but unmistakable. The crystals were responding to something, some shift in the emotional energy of the chamber. What's happening? I asked, watching as the color change accelerated, moving steadily from amber to a deep, resonant rose. Saurine's expression changed. Surprise, I thought, though it was difficult to be certain in the changing light. This is unexpected. The rose color deepened further, taking on hints of crimson around the edges of the crystals. It reminded me of human blushes, of Valentine hearts, of all the cultural associations humans had developed around the color of passionate emotion. Is it responding to you or to me? I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. Saurine approached me slowly, her movements measured, deliberate. I believe it is responding to what exists between us. The unspoken. My pulse raced, and with it, the crimson glow intensified. I could deny it, continue the pretense of professional interest, but the cave itself was making that impossible, amplifying and reflecting what I had tried so hard to conceal. "I'm sorry," I said, not meeting her eyes. "I know it's inappropriate, unprofessional. I've tried to." "Why?" she interrupted, now standing directly before me. "Why what? Why do you consider your emotions inappropriate?" she asked, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. I gestured helplessly at the space between us. "We're from different worlds. Literally. You're a senior military officer. I'm a civilian researcher. We're in the middle of delicate diplomatic negotiations after decades of conflict. Take your pick. Those are external circumstances," she said, "not emotional truths." The crimson light pulsed around us, seeming to flow between us like a current. I found myself wondering if it was revealing her emotions as clearly as it was revealing mine. I didn't expect. I began but stopped, uncertain how to continue. "That an Avenari would acknowledge emotions?" she asked, a hint of something like amusement in her voice. "We do not suppress them, Tomo Reyes. We channel them, direct them, use them with purpose." "And what purpose would this serve?" I asked, gesturing to the crimson-lit chamber, to the narrow space between us. Saurine was silent for a long moment, considering. When she spoke again, her voice held a new quality, less certain, more vulnerable. "I do not know," she admitted. "This is unfamiliar territory." Those words, that admission of uncertainty from someone who had always seemed so composed, broke something open inside me. Without thinking, I spoke the truth I had been hiding for months. "She doesn't know I love her. How could she?" The words escaped in a whisper, not intended for her ears, merely an expression of my own confusion. But in the crystal chamber, sound carried differently, amplified and directed by the formations around us. Saurine went very still, her eyes widening slightly, the most dramatic expression of surprise I had ever seen from her. The crimson light surged, then stabilized, bathing us both in its warm glow. I waited for her response. Rejection, diplomatic evasion, perhaps even anger at my presumption. What I didn't expect was for her to simply stand there, studying me with those absorbing eyes though seeing me clearly for the first time. Finally, she spoke. "This explains much," she said, her tone unreadable. Before I could ask what she meant, a low rumble shook the chamber. The crystals vibrated, their color shifting rapidly from crimson back through rose to amber and finally to a clear, almost transparent state. The sealed entrance to the cave suddenly shifted, the luminescent organisms parting to reveal an opening. Bright light poured in, along with the sound of voices calling our names. "Captain Saurine, Linguist Reyes, do you copy?" It was Commander Voss's voice, amplified through a field communicator. The storm must have passed, allowing the expedition team to locate us. Saurine looked at me, and in that moment of interrupted revelation, I saw something in her eyes I couldn't quite define. Regret? Relief? Resignation? Before I could decipher it, her professional demeanor returned, the vulnerability I'd glimpsed vanishing behind her composed exterior. "We're here," she called back, moving toward the entrance. Both unharmed. As we emerged from the crystal cave, we were greeted by the reunited expedition team. The landscape had transformed dramatically. The storm had cleared, leaving behind a sky of perfect azure, and the ridge that had collapsed beneath us was now solid once more, as though it had never moved at all. Only the luminescent organisms remained, their glow subdued in the daylight but still visible, pulsing gently at the cave entrance. "What happened?" demanded Commander Voss, her eyes moving between us with professional concern. "We lost contact completely, and then the terrain started shifting. We were drawn into a crystal chamber," Saurine reported, her voice even, betraying nothing of what had transpired inside. The indigenous organisms appeared to be responding to the electromagnetic disturbance from the storm. The Meridian botanist was practically vibrating with excitement. A crystal chamber with resonant properties? This could revolutionize our understanding of the adaptive zones. The organisms appeared to function as a unified system. I added, focusing on the scientific implications rather than the personal revelations. They relocated us to the chamber, possibly as a protective measure. As the team's attention turned to the scientific significance of our experience, I felt a strange emptiness settle over me. After months of concealing my feelings, after finally voicing them aloud, albeit unintentionally, we were back to professional reality as though nothing had happened. I wasn't sure what I had expected. A dramatic declaration of mutual feeling? An acknowledgement of the emotional truth the crystals had revealed? It had been foolish to hope for such things. Saurine was Avenari. Her culture valued emotional discipline above all. And more importantly, we both had responsibilities that transcended personal desire. The expedition regrouped quickly, establishing a perimeter around the crystal cave for preliminary study while preparing for return to the station. I found myself assigned to assist the xenobotanists in collecting initial data, while Saurine coordinated with her security team to ensure safe extraction. We didn't speak privately again during the remainder of the expedition. As we boarded the shuttle for return to Dorelia 7, I chose a seat far from hers, attempting to provide us both with space to process the unexpected intimacy we had shared and the awkward return to normalcy that followed. The shuttle ascended through Dorelia's atmosphere, leaving behind the adaptive zones with their responsive flora and revealing crystals. I wondered if I would ever return there, if I would ever again experience that moment of perfect emotional transparency that the crystal chamber had facilitated. Preliminary analysis suggests the crystal formations function as a form of emotional processor, announced one of the xenobotanists as we neared the station. They appear to amplify and reflect emotional energy within a closed system, potentially serving as a planetary regulatory mechanism. I noticed Saurine watching me from across the shuttle as the botanist continued his explanation. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an intensity to her gaze that reminded me of the chamber's crimson light. Fascinating implications for interspecies communication, commented Commander Voss. If emotional frequencies can be amplified and translated into visible light spectrums, we might develop new protocols for diplomatic exchange where verbal language fails. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, discussing the revolutionary potential of emotional communication, while Saurine and I retreated behind our respective cultural barriers, unable or unwilling to acknowledge what had passed between us. Back at Dorelia 7, life resumed its diplomatic rhythms. I submitted my research notes on the adaptive zones, carefully edited to focus on the linguistic implications rather than the personal experience. The committee meetings continued, the negotiations progressed, and I did my best to maintain professional composure when Saurine was present, which, to my relief and disappointment, became increasingly rare. She had reassigned herself to perimeter security duties, I learned from Eliza, which kept her away from the main diplomatic chambers. Whether this was coincidence or deliberate avoidance, I couldn't tell, but the effect was the same. We had fewer opportunities for the casual observation that had begun our complicated emotional entanglement. "You're moping," Eliza informed me bluntly, 3 weeks after the Crystal Cave incident. We were in the station's botanical garden, a carefully curated collection of compatible species from all 12 worlds represented at the station. "I'm contemplating," I corrected her, watching a luminescent vine that reminded me of the organisms on Dorelia's surface. "There's a difference. Not when you've been contemplating the same plant for 20 minutes with that expression on your face," she countered. "Something happened in that cave, didn't it? Something you didn't include in your official report." I sighed. Eliza knew me too well to be deceived by evasion. "Nothing happened," I said, which was technically true. We were trapped in a cave with crystals that reacted to emotional states. We were rescued. End of story. And yet Captain Saurine has suddenly reassigned herself to duties that keep her as far from you as possible, Eliza noted. That's quite a coincidence. I shrugged, unwilling to examine the implications too closely. The Avenari are private by nature. Maybe the experience was uncomfortable for her. Or maybe it was too comfortable, Eliza suggested, raising an eyebrow. Did you finally tell her how you feel? Not exactly, I hedged. It's complicated. Eliza rolled her eyes. It always is with you, Toma. She patted my shoulder sympathetically. Just remember that the conference ends in 2 weeks. After that, everyone goes back to their respective worlds. Whatever might have been, won't be, unless you do something about it. Her words haunted me as I returned to my quarters that evening. 2 weeks. 14 station cycles before the diplomatic conference concluded, before the representatives of 12 worlds returned to their homes with whatever treaties and agreements we had managed to forge. Before Saurine returned to Avenari space, and I to Earth, with an unspoken truth crystallized between us like the formations in that cave. I immersed myself in work, finalizing research papers and preparing linguistic analysis of the conference proceedings. If I couldn't resolve my personal situation, at least I could ensure my professional contributions were valuable. The days passed quickly, filled with the frantic energy of concluding negotiations and farewell ceremonies. On the final day of the conference, a formal closing assembly was scheduled in the Grand Observatory, the same location where Saurine had publicly confronted me about my persistent observation. It seemed fitting that the diplomatic cycle would end where our personal complications had begun. I dressed carefully in my formal Earth uniform, wondering if I would have an opportunity to speak with her before we departed. Not to confess my feelings again. That moment had passed, but simply to acknowledge what had happened, to find some closure that would allow me to leave Durelia 7 without regret weighing on me. The observatory was crowded when I arrived, representatives from all 12 species mingling in their formal attire, exchanging final pleasantries and contact information. The nebula beyond the transparent dome had shifted since the first reception, its gases now displaying hues of deep emerald and gold rather than violet and indigo. I scanned the room for Saurine, but didn't see her among the Avenari delegation. Perhaps she had chosen to maintain her distance until the very end, sparing us both the awkwardness of a final encounter. The ambassador took the central podium, calling for attention as she prepared to deliver the closing address. I moved to my assigned place among the Earth delegation, focusing on the diplomatic ceremony rather than my personal disappointment. Representatives of the 12 allied worlds, the ambassador began, we gathered to celebrate the conclusion of historic negotiations that will shape interstellar relations for generations to come. As she continued her speech, I felt a presence behind me, a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a familiar energy that I had grown attuned to over the past year. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Linguist Reyes came the low melodic voice I had replayed in my memory countless times. Your attention is required at the security station after the ceremony. I glanced back to see Saurine standing there in full formal Avenari regalia, her burgundy uniform, adorned with silver insignia that caught the nebula's light. Her expression was as composed as ever, but there was something in her eyes, a focus, an intention, that made my pulse quicken. Is there a problem? I asked quietly, conscious of the ongoing speech. No problem, she replied. A matter requiring linguistic expertise. 1 hour after the conclusion of this assembly, before I could ask for clarification, she moved away, returning to her position with the Avenari delegation. I turned back to the ambassador's speech, trying to focus on the diplomatic platitudes while my mind raced with possibilities. Was this truly a professional request, or had Saurine found a pretext for a private conversation? The closing ceremony seemed to stretch endlessly. Speeches from representatives of each world, formal signing of final protocols, exchange of ceremonial gifts, all the ritualized conclusion of a year's diplomatic work. Under normal circumstances, I would have been fully engaged, proud of what we had accomplished. Instead, I found myself watching the chronometer, counting the minutes until I could discover what Saurine wanted. When the assembly finally ended, I made my obligatory farewells to the Earth delegation, exchanged contact information with several colleagues I had worked closely with, and made my way to the station's main security hub. My heart was beating rapidly, a fact I was acutely aware of after the Crystal Cave's amplification of my emotional state. The security hub was unexpectedly quiet. No staff at the monitoring stations, no security personnel moving through the space. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood Saurine's instructions, until I saw her standing alone by the central command console, her back to the entrance. "Captain Saurine," I said, announcing my presence. "You requested linguistic assistance?" She turned, and I was struck again by her presence. The fluid economy of her movement, the intensity of her gaze, the subtle way the light played across her cedar-colored skin. "Toma Reyes," she said, using my full name in the formal Avenari style. "Thank you for coming." I waited for her to explain the supposed linguistic emergency, but she simply studied me, her head tilted slightly in that analytical gesture I had come to recognize. "Is there actually a matter requiring my expertise?" I finally asked, "or was that a pretext?" "Both," she replied, moving toward me with deliberate steps. "There is a linguistic matter of great personal importance that I wish to address before our departure." "I'm listening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the sudden hope rising within me. She stopped directly before me, close enough that I could see the faint pattern of darker flecks in her absorbing eyes. "In the Crystal Cave," she began, "you spoke words that were not intended for my hearing." I felt heat rise to my face, remembering my unintentional confession. "I did," I acknowledged. "I apologize if—" "No apologies," she interrupted. "What I wish to understand is why you chose silence afterward." The question caught me off guard. "I thought you preferred it that way." "You didn't acknowledge what I said. You immediately returned to professional duty when the team found us." "As did you," she pointed out. "We both retreated to the safety of our respective roles." "Yes," I admitted. "It seemed easier." "Easier," she repeated, as though testing the word. "Yes, but not truthful." My pulse quickened. "Truthful in what way?" Saurine took a breath, a small gesture, but significant for someone of her composed nature. "In the Crystal Cave, the formations responded to emotional frequencies. You saw the color change from amber to crimson." "I did," I said, remembering the warm red glow that had surrounded us. "What you may not have understood," she continued, "is that the crystal response was synchronized, not just to your emotions, but to mine as well." I stared at her, processing the implication. "You mean—" "The crimson response required resonance," she said, her voice softer now. "A shared emotional frequency. The crystals could not have generated that response from your feelings alone." Hope rose in me like the crystal's light, warming from the inside out. "Why are you telling me this now, after weeks of avoidance?" "Because I needed to understand my own response before I could acknowledge it," she answered. "Avenari do not typically experience such immediate emotional resonance with other species. It required analysis." "And what did your analysis conclude?" I asked, hardly daring to breathe. Instead of answering directly, Saurine stepped closer until we were standing much as we had in the Crystal Cave, close enough to touch, yet separated by the narrow space of cultural difference and professional obligation. "During committee sessions," she said, her tone taking on a formal quality that I recognized from our first encounter, "your visual focus rests on me, for durations that exceed standard human attention patterns." "Why do you keep staring at me, human?" The echo of her public question from months ago hung between us, but this time, in the privacy of the empty security hub, with the knowledge of what had passed between us in the Crystal Cave, I understood it wasn't an accusation, but an invitation. "Because I can't look away," I answered honestly. "Because since the moment I saw you, I've been drawn to you in ways I can't fully explain or rationalize. Because despite all the reasons it's complicated, our different worlds, our professional roles, the cultural barriers, I feel something for you that transcends those complications." Saurine studied me, her expression softening in a way I had seen only glimpses of before. "If you keep staring," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "you'd better be ready to be looked back at." The words weren't a declaration of love in human terms, but I understood their significance in Avenari culture, an acknowledgement of mutual seeing, of reciprocal awareness, of emotional resonance that defied the usual boundaries of her species. "I'm ready," I said simply. She extended her hand, not for a human handshake, but palm upward in the Avenari gesture of trust. I placed my hand over hers, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine, the subtle difference in texture that marked her alienness and yet did nothing to diminish the connection between us. "The diplomatic conference has concluded," she said, "but there are ongoing security matters that require an Avenari presence at Dorelia 7. And I understand Earth has expressed interest in establishing a permanent linguistic research position to study the adaptive zones." I smiled, understanding what she was offering. Not a dramatic solution to the complications between us, but time. Time to explore what existed beyond the Crystal Cave's revelation, beyond the constraints of our formal roles, beyond the assumptions of our respective cultures. "I've heard similar rumors," I said. "In fact, I was considering applying for that position, if it becomes available." "A wise professional decision," she replied, the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The linguistic opportunities are significant." We stood there in the empty security hub, hands joined, the nebula's emerald and gold light filtering through the station's viewports. Nothing was resolved between us. Nothing definitive had been declared or promised. And yet everything had changed. The silence had been broken, the distance crossed. As we walked together toward the habitat section of the station, not touching but close, I felt the weight of the past months lift from me. Whatever lay ahead, however complicated, however challenging, we would face it with the honesty the Crystal Cave had demanded of us. Saurine paused at the intersection where our paths would diverge, her quarters in the security section, mine in the diplomatic wing. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, no longer hiding from the observation that had started everything. "Until tomorrow, Toma Reyes," she said, her voice carrying a warmth I had once thought impossible from an Avenari. "Until tomorrow, Captain Saurine," I replied. As I watched her walk away, I thought of how far we had come from that first confrontation, from "why do you keep staring at me, human?" to this moment of mutual recognition. The alien woman might not have known I loved her then, but she knew now. And in her own way, shaped by her culture and experience, she had let me know that she saw me too. That was enough for now. That was everything.